Are you going to do the interview with me, or do you want to watch?
I'll do it with you.
Oh, you want to do it with me?
Well done.
Okay.
Eric, will you help me grill your daddy? Should we ask him some questions?
There are moments in life that stop you cold. Moments that strip away everything you have built, everything you have performed for the world, and leave you standing in the silence of something you cannot control. For Simon Cowell, one of the most powerful and polarizing figures in the history of global entertainment, that moment did not come from a boardroom. It did not come from a failed television pilot or a bad ratings quarter. It came quietly, the way the most devastating things always do, wrapped in the ordinary language of a doctor's office, in the clinical calm of a medical report that changed the way a father saw the world forever. Most people know Simon Cowell as the man who built an empire on sharp words and sharper instincts. The judge who sat behind a panel and decided, with what seemed like absolute certainty, who had what it took and who did not. For decades, that image held. The dark shirts, the high-waisted trousers, the slow lean back in the chair before delivering a verdict that could shatter a dream in seconds. That was the brand. That was the persona. And for a long time, the world believed that was the man. But something happened. Something the cameras only partially captured and the tabloids only partially understood. A shift occurred in Simon Cowell that went far deeper than a new diet or a change in television format. The man who once prided himself on emotional distance began to crack open. And at the center of that transformation was his son, Eric Cowell, and a chapter of their family story that Simon has never fully shared with the public until now. This is not a rumor. This is not a manufactured drama designed to trend on social media. This is the story of a father who came face to face with fear, with vulnerability, with the terrifying reality that love makes you fragile in ways that success never prepared you for. This is the story of Simon Cowell's emotional goodbye, and what it actually cost him to say it. To understand what Simon Cowell walked away from, you first have to understand what he spent 30 years building. Because it was not simply a career. It was an identity, a fortress constructed brick by brick from relentless ambition, an almost inhuman tolerance for pressure, and a willingness to say out loud what most people in the room were only thinking. He was not born into television royalty. He worked in the mail room at EMI Music. He failed. He lost deals. He signed acts that went nowhere and had to rebuild from scratch more than once. But what separated Simon from others who fell and never got back up was a fundamental refusal to let failure redefine him. He absorbed it, analyzed it, and came back harder. That pattern repeated itself until the failures became footnotes and the successes became landmarks. Pop Idol, American Idol, The X Factor, Britain's Got Talent, Psycho Records, a name that became synonymous not just with television, but with an entire era of popular culture. But here's what the highlight reel always leaves out. The cost of building something that large is paid in a currency most people never see. It is paid in sleepless nights and missed conversations. It is paid in the slow erosion of the ability to simply be present, because your mind is always somewhere else, always solving the next problem, always 3 steps ahead of wherever your body happens to be sitting. People around Simon during the peak years of his career have described a man who existed in a near-constant state of professional intensity. Work was not something he did. It was something he inhabited. He has spoken in interviews about working until the early hours of the morning as though it was simply the natural rhythm of his life. Going through ratings, reviewing footage, restructuring formats. Not because anyone demanded it of him, but because the alternative, slowing down, stepping back, letting go even briefly, felt genuinely dangerous. When your identity is fused with your output, rest does not feel like recovery. It feels like falling behind. That is the man who became a father at 54 years old. And that is why what happened next was so profound. Eric Philip Cowell was born in February 2014, and by every account from people who know Simon personally, his arrival rearranged something fundamental in his father. Not immediately, not in the dramatic, movie-ready way that stories sometimes get told, but gradually, in the way that real change actually works, through accumulation, through small moments that add up to something undeniable. Simon has talked about becoming a father in terms that still sound slightly surprised, as though even years later he cannot fully believe how completely it altered his internal landscape. He described it as suddenly understanding what truly mattered, not in the abstract, philosophical sense that people say such things, but in the immediate, concrete, daily sense. There was now a small person whose entire world depended on his presence, not his professional reputation, Not his ability to greenlight a television format. His actual presence. His time. His attention. For a man who had spent 3 decades treating time as a resource to be maximized for professional output, this was genuinely revolutionary. You cannot optimize fatherhood. You cannot delegate the moments that matter. You cannot schedule emotional availability into the margins of a 16-hour workday and expect it to be enough. Eric was not interested in Simon Cowell, the television mogul. He was interested in his dad. And that distinction, so simple on its surface, turned out to be one of the most transformative forces Simon had ever encountered. People who observed Simon in the years after Eric's birth noted the changes. He became more protective of his private time. He started stepping away from the relentless schedule that had defined him. He spoke differently about success, in a tone that suggested he was beginning to measure it differently, less by what he controlled and more by what he was actually experiencing. Friends described him as lighter, despite the added responsibility of parenthood, more grounded, more present in a room, which ironically had never been one of his defining traits before. But underneath that lightness, something else was developing. Something Simon did not yet have words for. Something that would not reveal itself fully until a quiet Tuesday morning in a doctor's office changed everything. The details of Eric's health journey have been handled with extraordinary care by Simon and his partner Lauren Silverman. They are private people in the ways that matter most, even when their professional lives are completely public. And that privacy is not a subject for speculation or exploitation. It is the right of every family to protect what is theirs, especially when it involves a child. What Simon has allowed the world to see, through carefully chosen moments and guarded public statements, is that fatherhood brought him into contact with a quality of fear he had never experienced before. The kind that does not respond to problem solving. The kind that cannot be negotiated away or resolved by calling the right person or throwing the right resources at it. The fear of a parent sitting across from a medical professional and being told that something may be wrong with your child. When you have spent your entire adult life in a world where power translates into control, where money and influence actually do change outcomes, sitting in a room where none of that matters is a collision with reality so severe it can rewire you permanently. Simon has hinted in interviews, carefully and without specific detail, at moments of genuine fear surrounding Eric's health. Not sensationalized, not performed for sympathy. Quietly, in the way that people speak about things that are still too close, too real, too personal to fully expose. And what those moments produced in Simon was not the image of a man crumbling. It was something more interesting, and ultimately more human. They produced awareness, a visceral, irreversible understanding of what vulnerability actually feels like when it is not happening to someone on a stage in front of millions of viewers, but to the person you love most in the world. This is the origin of the emotional goodbye the world has been watching without fully understanding. Simon Cowell was not saying goodbye to his career. He was not saying goodbye to entertainment or ambition or relevance. He was saying goodbye to the version of himself that had never truly known what was at stake. The version that could sit in judgment of other people's dreams without feeling the weight of his own. The version that could wake up at 4 a.m. consumed by ratings without once stopping to ask what he might be missing. That version of Simon Cowell could not survive what fatherhood brought him. And so it didn't. When people began noticing that Simon Cowell was different, their first instinct was to explain it with a simple narrative. A rumor. A medical diagnosis for his son, spread through social media thumbnails and algorithmic emotion, taken out of context and assembled into a story that felt real precisely because it was built on fragments of something true. The truth, as it turns out, is more complex and more interesting than the rumor. Because the emotional moments people witnessed on television, the pause before pressing a golden buzzer, the visible effort to hold himself together when a young performer shares a story of hardship, these were not symptoms of a hidden family tragedy being poorly concealed. They were evidence of a man who had been permanently opened by an experience he could not share in full, and who was now incapable of watching other people's pain without feeling it land. There's a contestant who stands out as particularly significant in the story of Simon's public transformation. Julia Carlisle, a young dancer who appeared on Britain's Got Talent, walked onto that stage carrying a diagnosis of scoliosis, a spinal condition that does not merely inconvenience a dancer but threatens the very foundation of what they have devoted their life to. She performed with a composure and a grace that was striking in itself. But it was the story behind the performance that visibly moved Simon in a way the audience had rarely seen from him. He did not cry on camera. That is not who he is. But those who study human expression, who know what restraint looks like on someone's face, could see it. A tightening around the eyes. A pause that lasted just slightly longer than it used to. A gentleness in his tone when he spoke to her that was qualitatively different from his default register. He later supported her in a way that went well beyond the mechanics of a television competition, investing significantly in her future, in her medical care, in the possibility that her story would not end where her diagnosis seemed to suggest it might. That decision made headlines. What made fewer headlines was why. Not charity, not publicity, not the strategic calculation of a man managing his image in an era of changing television values. It was recognition. Simon Cowell looked at a child whose dream was under threat from something she could not control, and he recognized something in that picture that he had come to know personally. The terrifying helplessness of loving someone whose well-being is not entirely within your power to protect. That is what the internet translated into a rumor about Eric. They saw the emotion. They saw the response. They saw a changed man, and they filled in the gaps with the most dramatic explanation available. But the truth required no drama. The truth was simply that Simon Cowell had become someone who felt things differently, because life had given him reasons to. In 2020, Simon Cowell had an accident that brought everything to a temporary halt in the most literal way possible. He was riding an electric bike at his home in Malibu when he fell and broke his back in multiple places. The surgery that followed was serious. The recovery was long. And for a man who had spent his entire professional life in motion, who had defined himself by his output and his relentless forward momentum, the enforced stillness was something close to a revelation. There is something about being forced to stop that reaches places voluntary rest never touches. When you choose to take a break, part of you remains in professional mode, monitoring, planning, preparing to return. But when your body simply refuses to cooperate, when the option of pushing through is removed entirely, you are left alone with something you have been successfully outrunning for years. Yourself. Simon has spoken about this period with more candor than he typically brings to personal subjects. He described it as a reset, a chance to examine what he had been doing and why, and to make decisions about what he actually wanted the next chapter to look like, and crucially, what he did not want to carry forward. The lifestyle that led to that accident, the physical recklessness, the diet that prioritized energy over health for too many years, the pace that left no margin for anything except performance, that was not going to survive the recovery. Not because doctors told him so, though they did, but because Simon himself had arrived at the understanding that he was not actually built to sustain it. Nobody is. He had simply been refusing to accept that truth for longer than most. What emerged from that recovery was a man who ate differently, moved differently, prioritized differently. People who saw him in person after his recovery described him as physically transformed, but also qualitatively different in a way that had nothing to do with weight loss or a new fitness regime. He seemed, in the precise sense of the word, lighter, less burdened, as though the accident, as awful as it was, had given him permission he had not previously been able to grant himself. Permission to be a person rather than a machine. Permission to let Eric see a father who was present, not merely financially successful. Permission to experience his own life rather than simply managing it from a distance. Here is the thing about genuine personal transformation that popular culture consistently gets wrong. It does not look like a dramatic announcement. It does not arrive with background music and a perfectly timed tearful speech. Real transformation is quiet, inconsistent, sometimes invisible to the people watching closest, and utterly clear to the person living through it. The Simon Cowell that longtime viewers have been noticing on Britain's Got Talent in recent years is not performing a new character. He is not conducting a strategic rebranding exercise because the television landscape changed and the audience no longer responds to cruelty as entertainment. Those things may all be true simultaneously, but they are not the explanation for what people are seeing. What they are seeing is a man who no longer has the same investment in emotional distance, who sits at that judging table not as the final authority on human talent, but as someone who has been reminded, repeatedly and personally, that the people on that stage are not performances. They are people, with families waiting offstage, with stories that did not begin when the music started and will not end when the buzzer sounds, with dreams that predate this moment by years and sacrifices that the audience will never fully see. When Simon presses a golden buzzer now, there is something in the gesture that was absent before. Not sentimentality, exactly. He is still Simon Cowell. He still has opinions and he still delivers them. But there is a recognition underneath it all, an acknowledgement that what he is witnessing costs something, that the person in front of him has paid a price to stand there, and that the least he can do is receive it honestly. That is what Eric gave him. Not weakness, not the softening of a man who lost his edge, the expansion of a man who finally understood what his edge had been protecting him from. Feeling things he did not have the framework to process until a small boy came into his life and rebuilt him from the inside out. So what exactly is the emotional goodbye that the title of this story promises? It is not a farewell to television. Simon Cowell remains one of the most active and influential figures in global entertainment. He is still developing shows, still shaping the industry, still sitting at the center of formats that reach tens of millions of viewers. It is not a goodbye to ambition or to the professional hunger that made him what he is. Those things are simply part of his nature, too deeply embedded to be wished away, and too genuinely useful to be worth abandoning entirely. The goodbye is to the lie that he had been living with so successfully that he had stopped recognizing it as a lie. The lie that work was enough. The lie that being the best in the room at what you do constitutes a complete life. The lie that emotional availability is a weakness rather than the only real currency of human connection. The lie that you can be fully present for a child while remaining fully devoted to the version of yourself that existed before that child arrived. You cannot. And Simon found that out. Not theoretically. Not through someone else's story or someone else's regret. He found it out through Eric, through Lauren, through the specific and irreplaceable experience of loving people whose well-being matters to you more than your own success. Through sitting in doctors' offices with information that no amount of professional achievement could change. Through holding his son's hand in moments the world would never see, and understanding in those moments that this, precisely this, was what everything else was supposed to be building toward. The emotional goodbye is what happens when a man who spent 30 years performing certainty finally lets himself admit that he does not have all the answers. That control is an illusion. That the things worth protecting are never the things you can put on a shelf and point to. They are the things that wake you at 3 in the morning and make you grateful to be awake. Because being awake means you are still here, still present, still part of the life you were almost too busy to notice you were living. The internet will continue to construct narratives about Simon Cowell and his family. That is simply the nature of the world we live in now, where attention moves faster than truth and where the emotional content of a thumbnail can go halfway around the world before anyone has stopped to ask whether it is accurate. Rumors about Eric's health will persist in some corners of social media because they are built on something real, the visible transformation of his father, even if the explanation they offer is wrong. But here's what the rumors could never capture, and what the true story actually offers if you are willing to sit with it long enough. Simon Cowell is not a man diminished by what fatherhood brought him. He is not a man weakened by fear, humbled into irrelevance, or softened into something less interesting than he used to be. He is a man who was given, late in life and not without cost, the one education that all his professional success could not provide. The education of unconditional love, and what it demands from you. It demands your presence. It demands your honesty. It demands that you look at the things that frighten you without flinching away, not because you are brave enough to conquer them, but because the person you love deserves to have you standing beside them regardless. It demands that you say goodbye to the version of yourself that was too defended, too controlled, too professionally armored to feel the full weight of another person's reality. That is the emotional goodbye Simon Cowell has been making, slowly and imperfectly and with occasional stumbles, in full view of an audience that mostly thought it was watching something else. It is a goodbye to the man he had to be in order to build what he built. And it is, by any honest measure, one of the most courageous things he has ever done. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't, because it happened in private moments and quiet decisions and small daily choices to show up differently than he had before. And because in the end, the most powerful stories are never about the version of ourselves we perform for the world. They are about who we become when the performance finally, gratefully, blessedly ends. And we are left standing in the truth of what we actually love, and why it was worth changing everything to protect it. That is Simon Cowell's real story, and it is far more powerful than any rumor could ever be.